What is this? And please, David and Matt jump in. But my last question is that there's this very basic idea that even, I would say people who are genuine liberals have made for a long time, like the Norman Mailer, Lewis Lapham types. It's just like you can't have a Republican with a secret intelligence agency that violates, that encroaches in domestic spying and foments coups and everything else. I think that makes sense. And then when we talk about getting into a place where we're at least thinking about programmatically what a left foreign policy would be, could it be as simple as somebody saying that, okay, you sit down with the CIA and you say, one function of having groups of people, and whether they do it well and what their ideological assumptions are as a whole, their question, but just as a theory, the idea that there's one group of people whose job is to try to track the world and see patterns and just the idea that everybody, no matter what organization you're in, government, corporation, whatever, you need information, you need intelligence, you need to understand how things work. This is a part of kind of doing business. Why is that necessarily part of the same structure and necessarily needs to be combined with, supporting death squads, fomenting coups? Obviously, I think what you'd say is that because that's the underlying policy structure, and I agree with you, but just functionally, if somebody came into office and said, we're going to have an intelligence agency that is, vigorously oversight and doesn't violate civil liberties, but the idea is to have an understanding and a map of the world versus a blueprint for intervention, regime change, and corporate espionage.
Yeah, and there were actually significant discussions during and after World War II about whether the United States should have a permanent intelligence agency. Obviously, most people in this establishment thought it did, but people on the outside criticizing it thought that it would lend itself to what exactly the CIA became. Particularly because, intelligence, no matter how good intelligence is, it's always very fallible. And I think you saw that particularly in the run-up to the Iraq War. And it wasn't only the CIA, but also intelligence agencies throughout the world amongst American allies also thought that Saddam was in the process or was seriously considering getting WMD. So intelligence is always faulty. So it's always very problematic to have such a powerful agency be an intelligence agency. Then the question is, which I think you're getting at, is do we even need an intelligence agency? Yeah. Is it possible for the United States to exist in a world without an intelligence agency? And then I think you start coming to really important questions of first principles that are really, I don't think that easy to answer, because listen, none of us love the United States. It's an incredibly problematic, genocidal at times state based on indigenous genocide and slavery and horrible capitalism. But that also
we also love it.
Right.
It's a paradox.
Yeah, of course. I think there's an element of that as well. And I think it's fair to say that we wouldn't want China invading the United States. I'm not saying this is a live possibility by any stretch of the imagination, just thinking through this problem. So is there a legitimate function of an intelligence agency within a left government? I would err on the side of there probably is. You probably need to have some sort of intelligence gathering institution dedicated to finding out what's happening in the world, so you don't get caught blindsided by a future Hitler. The problem, though, is that if we're talking about a Hitler, we could see how rare this is. But I think there's a role for a small peacetime intelligence agency. And then the question comes, how do you prevent it from overstepping its powers, which is very, very difficult. So the sort of left-wing argument in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was just everything's public. Like you publicize every diplomatic communique, you publicize every intelligence report, you publicize where everyone is in the world at all moments, and then this will enable some sort of democratic accountability to intelligence agencies. That might be the side that we initially err on, but there's also, I think, at least a legitimate role for government secrecy in certain instances. The problem, though, is that government secrecy tends to pursue sort of mission creep. And if one area is secret, then more areas become secret. And until you have what we have today, where seriously documents from 75 years ago are still considered classified. So this is a real problem. And I don't have an easy answer, though I do think that some sort of serious oversight involving the public would be sort of a sine qua non of having a left-wing intelligence agency, though I imagine there are some people who think that you just shouldn't have any intelligence agency at all. I don't think how that would would necessarily make sense today. But I don't know. What do you think about all this?
There was a guy, I forget the name of him, but there was a former intelligence officer who actually, unfortunately, kind of went off of the deep end, frankly, but he was writing some very interesting stuff in his sort of post-intelligence world and role, and just as a kind of public intellect. And he thought, in his big thing, I think, was he called it open source intelligence, just like
right.
A vast majority of things, and conceptually, it's really easy to say, like, a weapons silo is classified and you are not going to release how you get into it, or a source and method or something. But, beyond that, a lot of information is actually collected through, in some sense, public source domains.
Absolutely.
And you put it out there and you let the world both have, democratic transparency, which is a good value in and of itself. And then actually you also theoretically, you build out a more dynamic culture. Actually, you could almost flip intelligence on its head and say, this is part of, if it becomes, open source, becomes part of this big effort. I thought that was really interesting. And I think, it seems to me in the short run, you need to have practical means of limiting, that those are some bridges for things like the CIA. But again, separate from, I'm not talking about some type of like abolish the nation state thing or anything like that. That's nothing to do with anything that's happening now. But I would feel comfortable with, a premise like the original Dissonance, which is, you can have a military. Obviously, there's certain functions that you do need to have a modern, organized, bureaucratic, nation state. And I think within those institutions, there might be plenty of functions that serve as quote unquote intelligence, but autonomous agencies that operate sort of with those exclusive mandates, I don't see how they could be decoupled from, just these endless examples again, even overreach is just the wrong word. I mean, just policy and covert policy. So
yeah, and the CIA, I think it's supposed to be attached to the president. It's the president in the White House. And of course, as you implied, basically every organization has its own intelligence gathering capabilities anyway. So one could argue that you just don't need an independent one, like you said, that all of, State Department, Defense, etc., they all have their own intelligence gathering capabilities, and therefore you don't need this sort of potential rogue actor. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that as well. The problem, I guess, is just like if the left did get in, the capitalists would be trying to get us. So
that's also true. People should be learning. Learn from Venezuela, right? I mean, this is the other thing. Like, get real about these institutions. So you know what? Yeah. I think you're right. David, Matt, you guys have anything to add to this?
The only thing I would add is not to broaden it out necessarily, but it's just like, this is going to be one of the big structural political questions that we have. Because there's
a lot of feedback coming.
I don't know where that's coming from, but there's institutions like the CIA, Then there's also institutions like the Fed and the FBI, right, that are supposedly, under our purview, the Fed less so technically, but whatever, right, that are massively important and powerful in our society. And it's like, I don't know, fundamentally, the only kind of transition I can see is if we radically roll back a lot of the powers that these institutions have, because they have such staying power, right, that they can survive administrations. The CIA, I know the Federal Reserve a little bit better, and like the Federal Reserve's power are immense. And it's not even just the United States, right? It's like central bank powers across the globe have the power to push back against democratically elected governments. And I see the CIA and, intelligence institutions in that same kind of light, right? Where you have a strong institution that has their own goals and their own culture. And even though they're technically controlled by the democratic governments, they're going to do what they can to, protect their power.
We need to bring back the term, when I first heard the term deep state, I was in Turkey. And that really describes something in Turkey. I mean, that describes something almost that they would formally recognize themselves, right? Like, we are a network that encompasses the military, intelligence, gangs, newspaper editors. There's a real context in that country. At least there was. Some of that's been broken up. But before it became a kind of, catch-all conspiracy term, that was a great term. That did describe a set of permanent institutional interests, which you could describe obviously both in terms of intelligence overseas and central banks domestically as extensions of corporate America that form not a permanent government, that's conspiratorial, but a permanent set of institutional interests that were, there's a quote that's been well documented. It's not as comprehensive, but Bill Clinton complaining in 93 is like, you're telling me that my domestic policy is going to be set by a bunch of fucking bond traders?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. It was
pretty much. Yeah,
and that was all by design. I think I don't know if you ever had him on, but Quinn Slobodian, his new book Globalists, essentially shows.
You weren't listening to the post game, man. Oof. I literally just mentioned it actually in the first part of the post game. So yeah,
has he been on?
Yeah, I interviewed him like over a year ago.
Okay, good. So this. So Quinn basically demonstrated this.
Yeah.
And I think it's a broader. Quinn focused particularly on central banking, but I think it's and its libertarian connections. But I think it's a broader phenomenon you see after World War II in the North Atlantic, where you have the creation of these permanent institutions that are state institutions, but kind of not state institutions in the sense that they're not really accountable to any democratic constituency, whether it be a parliament or a Congress, or let alone the people. So I think this is sort of a general phenomenon of the last 70 years that we need to really talk about and think about more comprehensively.
Matt. Oh, guess he's muted. Okay, well, Bessner, this worked. This worked well. Let's do it again in another couple of weeks. Thanks for doing this, brother.
Yeah, always, man. Looking forward to it. Have a good night, guys.
You too, man. Stay safe.
Wow.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.